Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're literally popping the hood on one of the most powerful economic engines in human history. We're talking about the British Empire in North America. We're going to unpack the exact mechanics of historical trade, going way back to a time when global empires were built, not just on military might, but on the ruthless, calculating, and incredibly efficient flow of goods. So if you've ever wondered how small European island nations managed to accumulate such staggering wealth and power, well, the answer lies in the system we're about to decode right now. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the basics of trade. Second, we'll dive into the mercantilist wealth machine. Third, we'll look at different perspectives on the system. And finally, we'll weigh the pros and cons. Now, think about the very first encounters on the shores of North America. Indigenous peoples and Europeans established early trade networks, exchanging goods directly on the coast. And what's really fascinating here is that these relatively simple, localized interactions actually laid the foundational groundwork for what would soon become massive globe-spanning economic systems. It all started with basic exchanges of resources right here.
All right, Section 1, the basics of trade and grounding our economy.
At its absolute core, trade is simply the buying and selling of goods and services between markets. And sure, while the scale and technology have evolved dramatically over the centuries, this foundational exchange is the absolute bedrock of what we're unpacking today. It's just that simple dynamic of supplying a demand across borders. So, let's break it down. Imports. These are the goods brought into a foreign country, that vital flow of resources crossing into your borders to meet local needs. And on the flip side, exports are the goods sold or transferred out. Mastering this flow, what comes in versus what ships out, is the absolute key to understanding national wealth, both historically and today. To put this into perspective, let's look at a modern example, like Canada. We see a really distinct dynamic here. High-tech, manufactured goods like cars and computers flow in as imports, while primary resources like oil, grain, and lumber ship out as exports. Keep this specific exchange, raw materials for manufactured goods, in the back of your mind, because as we travel back in time, this exact pattern was leveraged as a highly calculated tool of empire. Moving on to Section 2, the mercantilist wealth machine and building an empire. So, what is mercantilism? It's an economic system that allowed an imperial country to become incredibly rich by selling resources taken directly from its colonies. But actually, scratch that. Don't just think of this as some dusty historical theory. Think of it as a hungry, relentless machine. It was purposefully engineered to extract massive wealth from faraway colonies and funnel it directly into the mother country to maximize imperial dominance. And this machine operated with ruthless efficiency, kind of like a closed-loop pump. First, the empire extracts cheap raw materials directly from the colonies. Second, they manufacture those resources into finished goods and then sell them right back to those very same colonists at highly inflated prices. Third, the resulting profit is hoarded as pure gold and silver in Britain. And finally, any surplus materials, like extra furs or fish, are exported to rival European nations for even more gold. It just steadily turns raw colonial goods into concentrated British wealth. The whole shebang was driven by one single overriding belief. The more colonies a country has, the richer it should get. This insatiable need for wealth justified continuous, aggressive expansion because, frankly, more land meant more resources, which meant more manufactured goods, which translated directly into more gold. The machine always needed to be fed. All right, Section 3, perspectives on the system. Basically, who wins and who loses. This is where things get really interesting, because this era was defined by intense, dramatic tension. Over in London, the king and English merchants are celebrating immense power and massive profits from selling products at those inflated prices. But across the ocean, the reality is starkly different. Settlers are getting crushed by high taxes and trade restrictions. And crucially, First Nations bear the most severe consequences, facing relentless, aggressive demands from settlers who are expanding to capture more land and resources for the empire. Because the boots-on-the-ground reality of mercantilism wasn't just guys looking at ledgers in London. It required immense physical labor, armed British soldiers actively protecting the imperial investment, and the systemic displacement of indigenous populations to feed the economic machine. Extracting wealth on this sheer scale demanded total physical and military control over the landscape. Which brings us to Section 4, Weighing the pros and cons, the ultimate balance sheet of empire. From a macro level, the systemic benefits for the empire were absolutely undeniable. Mercantilism successfully built a remarkably powerful home country, it fueled a massive manufacturing boom thanks to those cheap raw materials, and it provided transatlantic settlers with abundant land. It effectively engineered this huge, guaranteed, interconnected market where everything ultimately served the central hub. But, and it's a big but, the drawbacks created a literal ticking clock. Colonies were exorbitant to defend, requiring punishingly high taxes on the settlers to sustain that military presence. And by actively suppressing local colonial industries to force reliance on expensive British imports, the empire inadvertently created a pressure cooker. That systemic economic stranglehold practically guaranteed future unrest. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. Was the immense wealth generated by the mercantilist machine actually worth the human cost, the displacement, the high taxes, and the ultimate risk of rebellion? This really delicate balance between imperial profit and colonial suppression is what you should take away from this explainer today. Because when we look back, we can see exactly how the rigid, unyielding mechanics of this historical trade system inevitably sparked world-changing revolutions. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you on the next explainer.